Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how much volume is best to maximize muscle growth. First and foremost, we need to define what exactly volume means in relation to hypertrophy training. Volume for resistance training is a measure of how much work we perform over a given period of time. This is usually measured over the time course of one microcycle because this is the shortest repeatable cycle in a training plan. In most cases, the microcycle is 1 week long, which means volume is generally measured over the time frame of 1 week. There are two primary methods that can be used to quantify volume for resistance training, which we will now cover. The first is volume load. Volume load is the most accurate definition of work performed and is calculated by multiplying reps times sets times load times distance that the weight has moved. Volume load might be a somewhat useful metric for strength training, however it is not the best method to quantify volume for hypertrophy training. This is because it is clear from both the scientific evidence and anecdotal evidence that hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a spectrum of different rep ranges and loads, different exercises, and different techniques. Therefore, volume load won't provide us with a metric that can be used to compare different training strategies. It can only be used to compare the exact same style with itself. For example, we could achieve equal hypertrophy outcomes performing 3 sets of 12 to 15 reps in the dumbbell bench press in comparison to 3 sets of 6 to 10 reps in the barbell bench press. Even though volume load may be different between training protocols, the hypertrophy outcome will be very similar. So how can we quantify volume for hypertrophy training? It is understood that muscle hypertrophy can be equally achieved using a variety of different training styles. This has led to the development of using number of sets as a method to quantify volume for hypertrophy training. This systematic review concluded this is certainly a viable method when sets are taken fairly close to failure within the 6 to 20 rep range. Trainees can therefore use the number of sets performed per muscle group per week as a method to quantify volume. This allows trainees to compare and manipulate volume using different styles of hypertrophy training. So for the rest of this video, we will refer to volume as the number of sets performed per muscle group per week. So now that we understand what volume is, we now need to establish the volume hypertrophy relationship. The volume hypertrophy relationship is not completely clear, and more research is required to further understand how this variable influences muscle growth. The most comprehensive evidence we have exploring the influence of volume on hypertrophy is this meta-analysis. This meta-analysis clearly demonstrates a dose-response relationship between training volume and muscle growth. In other words, the more volume that was performed, the more muscle growth that was induced. However, this analysis groups studies into categories of 5, 5 to 9, 9 plus, and 10 plus sets per muscle group per week. From a practical perspective, 10 sets per muscle group per week is generally not considered a very high training volume in most hypertrophy-based training communities. Therefore, we need to consider if training with more volume than this would continue this dose-response relationship. Luckily, we have research exploring higher volumes. This study explored the effects of training with 16, 24, and 32 sets per muscle group per week. Similar to the initial meta-analysis, a dose-response relationship was found, where more volume resulted in greater growth at all sites measured. Furthermore, this study involved experimenting with the same training program using different set volumes. In the group who trained with a higher volume, some muscle groups were trained with up to 45 sets per week. Once again, we saw the same dose-response relationship, where more volume even up to these extreme levels resulted in greater muscle growth in all muscles measured. So from all this research, it certainly seems that hypertrophy can be achieved even with very low volumes, although the more volume that is performed, the more muscle growth we see. Another factor to consider is the individual response to training volume. While we clearly see that more volume results in greater growth, we need to understand that these results are presented as average values. Therefore, it is possible that the response to different training volumes may be somewhat individual. Going back to the study using extremely high training volumes of up to 45 sets per muscle group, in this figure we can see the individual responses of each trainee for both the biceps and triceps growth. Each line shows the muscle thickness from pre to post training for each individual subject. Although we can see that there are general trends, there is certainly some individual variation in the growth response. Some trainees saw more muscle growth than others with different volumes, and some trainees actually saw decreases in muscle size. Therefore, it should be understood that there is likely to be some variation in the individual response to different training volumes. One factor influencing this individual response may be the subject's training history. This interesting study explored the effects of increasing training volume with consideration for prior training history. The subjects performed different volumes of leg extensions for each limb. One limb was assigned to an arbitrary 22 sets per week, while the other limb was trained with an individualized training volume. This volume was 20% more than whatever training volume they had previously been training with for the quads. As we can see in this figure, the arbitrary 22 sets was more volume than some trainees had previously been training with and less for others. However, for the individualized training limb, the volume performed was slightly more than they'd been performing with for every single individual. Although on average both training interventions used the same average volume, the individualized limb saw significantly greater muscle growth than the arbitrary 22 sets. This indicates again that increasing training volume seems to result in greater muscle growth, although this increase should be relative to the individual's prior training volumes. So as it seems, more volume appears to result in greater growth, especially when this increase is relative to training history. However, when does this relationship end? Should we just continue to increase volume forever? Firstly, we should understand that all of these training interventions are relatively short-term studies. Most of them are between 4 to 8 weeks long, and at a maximum 12 weeks long. Furthermore, these results don't include subjects that dropped out or any negative consequences of the training intervention. In reality, we need to manage training volumes for months and years on end, rather than looking at training in a vacuum of 4 to 8 weeks. There are inevitably limitations to how much volume we can perform at any given point in time. We will now cover what factors may limit volume and what this means practically for trainees. The first factor is joint tolerance. Ultimately, there is a limit to how much stress each joint can handle over any given time frame. Training with volumes beyond this threshold will result in joint pain or irritation in the short term and may result in chronic injury if this stress persists. Joint tolerance will vary between individuals and between different joints for the same person based on factors such as anatomical structure, training history, injury history, perception of pain, exercise selection, and external load. Furthermore, the acute risk of injury is elevated when we experience sudden changes in workload. This study found that cricket players who experienced drastic increases in bowling load in a short time frame were associated with higher injury rates. This study found a similar result in rugby players where sudden spikes in running workload was associated with increased injury risk. Furthermore, this same study found that high chronic workloads were associated with a greater resilience to injury. Therefore, it seems that tissues are able to adapt over time to tolerate more stress. Although these studies were not conducted in a resistance training context, the principles of workload are likely universal to all forms of physical stress. From this data, we can extrapolate some recommendations for resistance training. First, we should avoid sudden changes in training volume over a short time frame, as this will increase our likelihood of joint pain. Second, our tissues can actually adapt over time to tolerate more volume. However, no matter how carefully we manage our volume, there is ultimately still a limit to how much stress our tissues can handle each week, and we must stay below this threshold. The second factor which may limit total volume is systemic fatigue. Systemic fatigue is a very vague and non-specific concept. This refers to the recovery capacity of the entire organism, including all forms of stress. Like the principles of joint tolerance, there is only a finite amount of stress individuals can handle at any given point in time, and breaching this threshold will have negative health and performance consequences. Breaching systemic capacity will increase the risk of illness, inhibit lifting performance, and may have negative effects on hormone regulation and essential bodily functions. Total training volume is one contributor to systemic fatigue, but other stresses include work stress, family and relationship stress, sleep or lack thereof, and other physical activity. Inevitably, there is a threshold of how much volume each trainee can handle before breaching this systemic threshold and experiencing negative outcomes. This is generally something that accumulates over a chronic period rather than an acute time frame. This means that trainees may be able to handle a certain level of stress for a short time frame, but it may only result in negative effects after multiple weeks or months. Like any other human system, it is likely that our systemic capacity can increase over time, allowing trainees to tolerate greater training stress. This may allow more volume to be performed over time before breaching the systemic capacity. However, there is ultimately still a threshold of what is too much, and trainees should avoid performing so much volume that they breach this capacity. And the last factor that could potentially limit training volume is practicality. This refers to the constraints of each trainee's lifestyle. This is influenced by factors such as time available to train, willingness to train, participating in other forms of exercise, and personal preference. These constraints may limit how much volume we can perform in any given week. For example, a trainee may only be able to train 3 times per week for around 1 hour due to their personal lifestyle and preference. Therefore, there is only so much training that can be performed within these time constraints, and this may limit total volume. So as far as we understand, more volume generally results in greater muscle growth, especially when it is individualized based on training history. However, as we mentioned, volume is likely to be limited by one of these 3 factors previously discussed. Ultimately, there is only a finite amount of volume we can perform each week. Therefore, we should probably allocate volume based on preference. In other words, more volume should be allocated to muscle groups that the trainee wants to specifically develop, and less volume to muscles that they aren't as concerned with developing. These preferences can also be changed over time based on the individual's specific goals and rate of progress. As we allocate more volume to certain muscle groups, we are more likely to see a faster rate of growth. So what practical recommendations can we conclude from all of this information? Well, firstly, volume seems to be a primary driving factor for muscle hypertrophy. However, before increasing training volume, we should also consider training history. It seems that randomly increasing volume to an arbitrary number probably increases the likelihood of injury and results in poorer hypertrophy outcomes. Therefore, if the goal is to increase volume, trainees should very gradually increase this over time and avoid sudden spikes. Furthermore, it should be understood that volume cannot be increased infinitely, as there are multiple factors which are likely to limit our total weekly workload. 3 primary factors include joint tolerance, systemic fatigue, and practical limitations. This means that there is ultimately a limit to how much volume we can train with, although we should probably try to maximize volume within these constraints. Trainees can then allocate this limited volume based on personal preference to emphasize certain muscle groups over others. And lastly, trainees should continuously adjust training over time based on their individual response to different volumes. Slight adjustments over time can help find what volume suits you best. This volume can always be adjusted based on changes to your personal preferences, rate of progress for certain muscle groups, changes to lifestyle practicality, joint irritation, and overall systemic fatigue. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.